we finished 1 Corinthians, and we've been going through the book of Psalms. And we're going to go through Galatians this fall and just talk a lot about God's grace. And we thought this summer, let's just camp on the Psalms and see what they have to instruct our hearts. And there's, especially for those who may be joining us for the first time, the Psalms are maybe a book of the Bible that you've read for devotion times or whatever, to receive encouragement and just to learn what it means to follow God, to learn how to pray. And we've gone through a lot of different kinds of psalms over the past several weeks. Psalms of praise and lament and intercession, and there's just a lot of different prayers prayed over the past 3,000 years. And the book of Psalms really represents God's people and the journey that we've been on. And if I could summarize in some way just what the book of Psalms is really doing for us, is I think it basically shows us how to walk with God through life's ups and downs. Because there's a lot of those for all of us. You know, we may feel like what we're going through nobody else has experienced before, but that's not true. That being a human being means that we are all walking a similar path. And some of us have some severe things going on in our lives at times, and we need to come around to one another in the midst of that. And others are praising God, just like Arthur was talking about too. But the Psalms, and C.S. Lewis even made this observation in his commentary on the Psalms. He said, it's funny when you read through them, if you read through them methodically, you're going to come across Psalms that you go, I can't relate with this. I don't feel that way. Even if you're doing really well and you read a Psalm of lament, like we're going to read today, you may read through that and go like, I can't relate with that. And the wonderful thing about being a part of the church, God's people, as we wait for his return, is that even if you have that experience as you're reading through the Psalms, it's a good reminder when you feel that way to say, but wait a second, someone else does feel that way. I might not feel that way, but someone else does. And it actually sort of encourages us to step into people's lives and minister to them and care for them and be a part of their lives. So this book is really important for our devotional life, to learn how to pray and minister to one another through life's ups and downs. And another sort of umbrella, I think, to help you understand the Psalms, Eugene Peterson wrote a great book called Answering God, which is another commentary on Psalms. And he made the observation that as you read through them, really what you're seeing is people answering God in these written poems and songs, which we call the Psalms. It's people responding to and answering God in the things that they're experiencing, and they're communicating with him. And God is also communicating with them. But really, these Psalms, we're going to see this morning, this is a really challenging psalm. It's kind of heart-wrenching. It is the cry of the heart of answering God, who actually seems pretty silent at times, and a faint and distant memory for this writer who wrote this psalm. And so it's an important book for our devotional life, because as we go through life, and you may not be experiencing some right now that's really hard, but you probably know somebody who is. The reality is that the world is full of questions, and we are full of questions. And it is God himself and his word who provides really the only supreme satisfying answers. And if we get into a habit of going to the world first, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, to find the answers or the solutions or the remedies to the problems that we're facing, whether it's physical, mental, any kind of thing that we're struggling with, if we go to the world first to seek the remedy, we're going to really come up short. And we're going to eventually, I think, probably get to where Asaph was in this Psalm 77, where he realized that the only place he could go was God to deal with what he was dealing with. And so, as we enter into this, it's hard reading a 3,000-year-old poem. When we live in a time when we've got cell phones and doctors and psychologists and all sorts of resources, and we know so much about the universe. 3,000 years ago, when Asaph wrote this psalm, life was a lot simpler, and especially for people of faith like him. And so for us to put ourselves in his shoes, which I really want you to do, and we really talk about this as a church, is really getting into the context of what we're reading and studying. Really get yourself into Asaph's world 3,000 years ago, where when he was going through the trials and the struggles that he was going through, he didn't have a whole lot of other options to seek out remedies for what he was dealing with. He only had God to cry out to. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about how actually Asaph had an advantage on us, I think, because of how simple and austere really reality was for them in terms of knowledge about the things that we know a lot about in our modern minds. And maybe there's something we can learn from Asaph, because we do need to go back and actually join him in what he wrote, probably to experience the satisfaction and the release and the peace that he experienced. Because the world, as great as it is, and as wonderful remedies as we can find in the world that we offer, God really can only provide the most satisfying remedies. So that's why we study these old ancient texts, because they really do bring true life. Talking about Asaph crying out to God in this text, and we'll read it in just a moment. There's a couple other things I want to just kind of help us put ourselves in his shoes a little bit. If you think about us today, for example, if a couple is having infertility problems, for example, maybe you've known someone who they want to have a child and they can't, right? Oftentimes, and usually probably most of the time when people are struggling with something like that, they go to a doctor and they get fertility pills, medication. And oftentimes, pretty regularly, like a magic wand, then they have a baby because of the fertility pills. For Asaph and the people he was ministering to and living amongst, when someone was barren, a woman was barren, in that time, 3,000 years ago, where did the husband, where did that couple go to solve that heart-wrenching problem that they were dealing with? There were no doctors, there were no fertility pills like we know today. They had to cry out to God and God alone. Isn't that intense to think about how different really our context is? But it's not necessarily better today. In fact, it might actually be clouding and holding us back from experiencing God in ways that these psalm writers experienced. Or another example, there are a lot of people who struggle with, mental anguish and despair and depression. And, today when you're struggling with that, we have so many options. We can go to a psychiatrist. We can go to a psychologist and seek help. And they have all sorts of tools and things that have been tested and looked at for hundreds of years that might be helpful. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, because we probably should. And the things that we experience and have today are really great. But for Asaph, when people were despairing and had, the struggles and the intense depression and darkness that some of us go through even, they didn't have psychiatrists. They didn't have depression medication. What did they do? They did what is in this psalm. They cried out to God. And it caused them to know God and experience God. And I think the same is true for us today. But we may need to discipline ourselves and actually change our thinking a little bit to where do we go first? Are we going to exhaust everything that the modern society can offer us? Or are we going to learn as God's people that actually the place to go with all of these trials and sufferings first is to cry out to God, because he is the source of any good remedy. So you can kind of see maybe, just two examples there, of how our world with modern biology and psychology and all the stuff that we have might actually put us at a little bit of a disadvantage to actually knowing and experiencing and worshiping and enjoying God. The first half of this psalm that we're going to read here in just a moment is really Asaph's cry, and it's gut-wrenching. We're going to read it, and I hope I do it justice. And some of you may be able to really identify with what he felt, but he is crying out. He feels abandoned. He's disappointed with God. If you read the book by Philip Yancey, Disappointment with God, I highly recommend it. Story after story of people who feel this way. He's desperate for the closeness with God in the midst of his suffering. He's also brutally honest in the first half of this psalm, which I think is another good application for us, is that for us to grow in God, we have to learn how to be honest with him and let it out with him and with our community. We can't hide and do things on an island of ourselves and think it's going to work out, because it won't. So you see that in the first half of this psalm. And you also see the gut-wrenching question that has never been answered and probably never will be until Jesus comes back, which is the problem of evil in the world. Why is there so much suffering when God says and claims that he is good and loving and sovereign over all things? How is it that such evil exists? You hear that in Asaph's honest prayer, and maybe some of you struggle with that. And the second half, as we read through this, just kind of giving you an outline of this, is really the remedy that Asaph provides. And it's an ancient remedy, and there's actually a little bit of a change now because of Christ and what he did. We can add something to this psalm, but for him, all they really had was to look backward. For Asaph, the remedy to dealing with life's big questions and pain and suffering was to look back at how God has worked in the past and shown his love to his people in the past, where they could remember that, because in the moment, he couldn't see it. It was like God was completely absent. So what do you do when you feel that way? You first look back and see who God is and who he has shown himself to be in the past. One little practical suggestion I was just thinking about, like in my own walk with Jesus, is when I feel like Asaph did in those moments, biographies can be really helpful. Reading about other Christians who've walked with God for many years in really tough situations. Like if you haven't ever read a Christian biography or of a missionary or something like that, I highly recommend making that a part of your walk with Jesus, because it can just strengthen you. And you read a story of something that actually happened and God actually did in someone's life, you're like, oh yeah, that's God. I don't see him now, but I believe that's who he is. And that is just a part of life that we're all going to experience. Maybe some of you, to be specific, are desperate in your suffering. Maybe some of you have a sickness, a disease, some kind of ailment that you maybe haven't even talked to anyone about, that you're struggling through. And it's not going away even though you ask God for help. Why is that? How is that possible with a sovereign God? That's the question Asaph asks. Maybe you're a parent struggling with one of your kids, or you're a kid struggling with loneliness, which I know is just an epidemic today of young people feeling lonely and abandoned. Social media doesn't seem to be helping that. It's not a solution that's working. And we as a church want to address the loneliness that people feel. Or maybe you're disoriented. Maybe you're struggling with a sense of purpose. You don't know what you should do in your work or situation. You're fearful about the future. All those things can put us in this position where we're paralyzed and it seems like God is not there. So what do we do? Well, I hope this psalm, as we read it now, if you want to turn to Psalm 77, will help you meet with God in a very real way in whatever trial you're going through. Whether it's your own trial or someone who you love is going through a trial, we need this psalm. So would you read with me Psalm 77, a psalm of Asaph. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. And then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? All his promises at the end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Oh, this is the cry of a person in deep anguish. And then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. So he looks backward now. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work. He's disciplined. I will ponder your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. And then he recounts a couple very common, memorable stories, the crossing of the Red Sea for Israel, which, by the way, do you think Israel for 400 years in slavery may have felt some of this too, like God had abandoned them? Yeah, for 400 years. Asaph is remembering, though, God came through and he was there. They just couldn't see him at the time. This is what he says: when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. And then listen to this verse 19. I think verse 19 is actually the central verse of this psalm to understand the meaning of what Asaph is getting at. And he says this: your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. But to go back to verse 19, we couldn't see you in the midst of those trials, but we know you were there. You've proven it in the past, and we know it's true today. What do we do when we can't see God's footprints? That is what this psalm is getting at. When you don't see him being right there with you or feel that, does that mean that he's not there? Should you despair and just wander off and just do life on your own and give up and say, I'm chucking it. God's not faithful to me. I'm not going to be faithful to him. Lots of people have done that. But is that what Asaph did? No. He said, I didn't see your footprints, but I believe that you were there. Wow. That is faith. That many of us are going to be tested in life to see, can we say that same prayer? Very challenging stuff. But I believe that in three ways, the third one is a little bit more of a nuance I'm going to bring in at the very end, but two for sure, specifically in this text. This psalm proposes a remedy for when we go through really, really, really hard times where God seems absent. And it also deals with what do we do intellectually when we bump up against the problem of evil. If you haven't bumped up against that and actually had to start studying it before, you probably will at some point in your life. And the problem is this: how can a good and loving God who's totally in control allow such natural evil to take place in our world and moral evil that deeply impacts not only people who don't believe in him, but also people like us who do believe in him? That is a problem. And people who have been intellectuals, way smarter than me, have been wrestling and studying and trying to figure it out for centuries, and they still haven't, and they're not going to. So that's spoiler alert. The problem of evil. There are some things I'm going to share which I hope are helpful, but it is a real problem because it drives us to our knees in faith like Asaph did and say, I still believe even though I don't see your footprints. I don't fully understand this, and I'm not going to walk away. So this psalm provides a remedy for that. And I think it happens in three words. And in your bulletin, if you look there, as I've studied through this, I think this might even be like something to remember. They all start with H, so it's easy to remember. And it's this. The first is humility, that we respond to our present moment, that we're going through difficulty with humility. Not with pride, arrogance, pointing the finger, but with humility. That's what Asaph did. And secondly, hindsight. He relied upon the past, testimonies of other people who God has ministered in their life, history, stories in Scripture of God working in history. His hindsight gave him the strength to carry on in the present moment. And then lastly, we'll talk very briefly about hope. Because we as Christians, because we have seen Jesus in the good news, the Gospels, the New Testament, how he fulfilled God's plan of salvation, which Asaph didn't have that privilege in what he was dealing with. We have seen now how Jesus is the fulfillment of God's plan. And so we now don't have to just look backward like Asaph had to do. We have one more tool in our tool belt in our faith, and that is that we can actually look forward. We can look with hope to the return of Jesus and eternity with him, which is going to be perfect, where there are no tears and there is no suffering. And God is going to completely, through his wrath, carry out justice on every wrong, everything that has impacted you or someone else, whether that's through a human being or through the principalities of evil or the devil himself. God will bring justice in the end. And we can have hope in that, and that gives us the strength to carry on. So those three words hopefully can be something that maybe you can meditate more on. So the big idea of this text, which I put in the bulletin, is basically this, is how do you and I keep following God when he has disappointed us? And if we're honest, it's okay to say that. That, you know what, God hasn't done or followed through in the way that I think he should have, and I'm really disappointed by that. It's okay to say that to God and have an honest relationship with him. He's big enough to handle that. He knows how hard it is. But now, how do we keep following him even when we are gravely disappointed? So humility. Go back to the text here real quickly. And we see how Asaph surrendered his present circumstances honestly. So you got to be honest, or else you won't feel close to God. And humbly, which is also true. If you're not humble, if you're pointing the finger and you're walking in pride and blaming God, you also won't experience closeness with him, because we're not created for that kind of relationship with him. So with humility, honesty, and humility, Asaph was comforted. So read in verse 1 and 2. I cry aloud to God. So have you ever cried aloud to God? Have you ever gone, even in the forest or something like that? Like, I've done that, like get far away from anybody who's going to hear, and just like at the top of your lungs, cry out in pain. If you haven't done it, it's really therapeutic. You should go try it. So someone across the way might think that you're yodeling or something like that, but just do it. Cry aloud to God. Be honest, and he will hear me. He believed that. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. There's this honest, humble cry. And when I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. God comforts us even when our soul is refusing comfort. If we can just be honest and cry out, and we're humble, even when we're stubbornly refusing comfort, God somehow gets through our honesty and our humility and actually brings comfort. I think that's what Asaph was experiencing. So it's even okay. I've had a stiff arm before, and I'm sure you have too, to God. Just like, nope, tried that, prayed that, you haven't answered it, I'm stubborn. But if I can still just remain honest and humble, God is going to break through my stiff arm and soften me and comfort me. That is a hopeful message for this world. There's a lot of people who have a big stiff arm up right now. You know, there's a lot of anger. I've struggled with anger throughout my life. I'm imagining a lot of you have as well. When there's injustice in your own life, disappointment, you're exhausted by pain, you're disoriented, you've had severe loss that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Maybe you're feeling angry. Asaph said this in verse 4, you hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I can't even speak. That's like the end of the rope that Asaph was experiencing. He was in such exhaustion from the pain. Maybe for you, that's come through abandonment. Maybe some of you have felt abandonment from a parent or a loved one or a spouse. Or maybe you grew up in a family where the parents split and you as a child even feel abandoned and you feel like I'm walking with a limp my whole life because my parents' marriage dissolved and that is just too painful for me to be the same person ever again. Guess what? That's a normal experience for many, many people. And that's probably the honest way to describe it. We don't need to fake it and say, no, I'm good. It's all right. Yeah, it's good for you. It's good for them. It'll all work out. I'm good. I'm resilient. Yeah, maybe. But the reality is you're probably walking with a limp. And maybe you're still struggling with that abandonment. And maybe there's little aspects of that you're still putting on God, of like, God, how could you have done that? And that's keeping you from experiencing closeness with him. It did for Asaph, so it probably does for us as well. How about this? Have you ever expected something really good to happen to you? Like maybe you did a good job, or you served, or you did something right and loving or kind or whatever, and then the response to what you did was the exact opposite of what you expected. And you were so hurt because you're like, wait a second, I thought I was, and yet you think, or you're blamed, or you're accused of something that you didn't do, or someone misinterpreted. Those are things that we all experience, and that is just radically painful. If maybe that's where you are, if you were expecting to be treated one way, but you've been treated another, and you've never really resolved that with God. And that's holding you back from closeness with him. Well, Asaph said in verse 4, I am so troubled, I cannot speak. You know, I've heard, and I have a friend who climbed Mount Everest. At the time, he was the youngest person who climbed it, but now there's been younger people who've beat his record. But I remember we were talking about mountain climbing and just parallels to life, and and it parallels to this moment as well. He was saying that when you're coming down off of a high mountain like that, especially Everest, that what the experts will tell you before you go up is that when on your way down, do not ever sit down. If you sit down, you are dead. It's that drastic. And I was thinking about Asaph in this moment, like, and he says, I am so troubled I can't even speak. That is the moment right there where a person feels like sitting down. That's it, I'm giving up. I'm done. I've done everything I know to do. Nobody can give me solace, nor can God. I'm done. And so now is the time when I sit down. And that is the time when you die, when you're on Mount Everest. And I think in a spiritual sense, in a physical sense, in a real life sense, we need to be helping each other and seeing in one another's lives when people in our midst are getting really burned out, really stretched, going through really hard things. And we need to be those voices to remind them, don't sit down. God will give you rest, but let's keep walking. Let's keep moving towards God. Let's keep going. Don't sit down. It's tempting, isn't it? When you're on Everest and you're that exhausted, like the only thing you want to do is sit down. Well, I think for a lot of us, maybe that's what we're feeling or have felt before too. I want so desperately just to punch out and sit down. But we as a church can encourage one another. Hey, there's been a lot of people who felt like this, but don't do it. I'll walk with you. Don't sit down. You know, I think even, I was thinking this week, I've had a couple situations, ironically, which happens a lot of times when you're teaching this week, that are just really, really heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching situations that I've been a part of. And so I've been thinking this week about the problem of evil myself. I had to go back and read a whole lot of stuff I studied decades ago in seminary, because I was like, man, yeah, what? How does that work out, God? How can you allow this to happen? And so maybe some of you are experiencing intellectual torment from time to time, where you're just like, this doesn't make sense and this is keeping me from God. Or maybe you have friends who intellectually just say, no, I can't follow a God who does that or allows these things to happen. Have you ever heard anybody say that? How can you follow a God who's like that? It's an intellectual trial that people face. Asaph said it this way. He didn't have modern psychology to give him words or whatever, but this is what he says in verse 7 through 9 when he was dealing with the problem of evil. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? I mean, it is just like one thing after another. He is being honest and saying, there's a real problem. Evil is so rampant and is affecting me so much, and you don't seem to be doing anything about it. How can that be? Boy, that's tough. So I wanted to just take a very short little pause here and just talk about the problem of evil, because I've been thinking about it and encouraging myself, and I just want to offer a couple reminders for us if you struggle with those questions. And one thing that's really helpful is to think about evil that we experience in the world in two ways. One is moral evil, and one is natural evil. Okay? It's all evil, but they're kind of two different things. Moral evil is, I think, a lot easier for us to understand, and basically is that people do really bad things to each other. We hurt each other, we're violent, we sin against each other. Morally, we do things that are evil, every single one of us, and we're all like, yep, I understand that. And you can even understand when really horrible things happen to good people through someone who does evil towards them. Because if I'm honest, I go like, well, outside of God's help, I could see myself doing the same thing. I'm that evil without Christ and without his forgiveness. So moral evil, I think, is an easier one for us to understand. Natural evil is the one, I think, where the real problem lies. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, devastating things, disease, birth defects, all the things that because of the curse and because our parents, Adam and Eve, in their free will, which for whatever reason God said to be fully human, you have to have free will because I want you to choose to love me. They chose to disobey. And this rush of consequences and evil, natural evil we call it, rushed into the world that we live in now as a result of their disobedience. And now we're part of it too because we're sinners. Can't just blame them. But the reality is that there are things that happen in this world that are very evil and really hurt people, both people who could care less about God and people who love God, and it seems like equally impacted by natural evil. How is that? Why does God allow that? That's really, I think, the source of the problem that people face, and it came from the Garden of Eden. And I think we need to look at this problem, natural evil, in a couple ways. One is this, is that in the same way that natural evil affects every one of us, so does common grace. God also, in verse 45 of chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus says this, "For God, he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." We live in a world where whether you're good or bad, evil or unjust or just, we all experience common grace in our lives. God reigns and provides and is good to all humanity in many different ways. But it'd be great if we could stop there. In the same way, it seems like in this world, God also allows natural evil to equally impact those who are just and unjust, those who are good and bad, those who are righteous and those who are evil, those who are striving for God, those who hate God. All of us are in the same boat and are impacted by tornadoes and hurricanes and death and birth defects and loss. And so that therein lies the problem, is how can a good God allow this all to happen? Does that detract from God's goodness and who he is because he allows evil to run rampant the way it seems like he is? That's really the question. And I think one thing that's really helped me process this, and again, this problem is not going to be solved, but one thing that helps me is this. Our God is so loving and so good that he actually allowed himself to also become a victim of evil. To me, that's really the game changer. He's so empathetic and loving and kind and good that he came into our world, sent his son, Jesus, who is perfect and without sin, the most kind and loving and perfect man, never did a wrong thing or said a wrong word in his life. You couldn't have anything against Jesus because he was without sin, and he is the one and only Son who never sinned of the Father. And the Father subjected himself to such pain and suffering by crushing his Son, Jesus, with the weight of the sin and evil of all humanity for all time on his one Son who didn't deserve it. So if we ever for a moment think, oh, God's not loving, he's not kind, he doesn't understand what I'm going through, That's where we need to change our thinking. That is the crux, and I think that's what people need to hear is like, yeah, we do live in an evil world, and it is really broken. But guess what happened 2,000 years ago? Our God sent his son to this evil, broken world and subjected himself to the very evil that makes us suffer, that causes little babies to die early from diseases and the most horrific, horrible things that you can imagine. Well, God subjected his son to that same evil. Moral evil, nailing him to the cross, spitting on him, hammering a thorny bush on his head and mocking him because he called himself the king. Moral evil and natural evil. Jesus had to experience the pain of the world that he lived in as well. And maybe that is helpful to you. Maybe it's not, and I understand if it's not, but for me, that has been something that's been comforting to me, is that yes, bad things happen to good people, but God allowed really bad things to happen to his son. And in fact, the worst thing, not just my sin, but all of your sin and everybody's sin who's ever lived was on Jesus. He suffered and was crushed. That's love. That is goodness. And so maybe, as I thought about this a little bit too, like why does God allow us to experience the same thing as everybody else, even though we're saying yes to him and following him? I wonder if in God's mercy, he knows that if it was any different, we might not be very empathetic and loving towards those who are lost. If somehow, by believing in Jesus and saying yes to God, now my life is just a rosy path towards heavenly bliss. Well, then I probably wouldn't care that much about my neighbors or other people who have a baby who has leukemia or is struggling and there's no answers to those questions, and all I can do is just cry and just stand with them and just sit there with my mouth open and say, I don't know what to tell you, but how can we help you? I wouldn't be very empathetic if it was any different. I wonder if for all of us that's a part of God's reason or purpose in allowing us to experience the same natural evil. That he doesn't insulate us. He doesn't turn bullets into popcorn when they come out of people's guns when they shoot at us. He allows evil to happen. And I think it's probably because he knows that we're all in the same boat and we need to empathize with one another. So just in this last couple of minutes, I want to just re-emphasize hindsight, the remembrance aspect of this psalm. And I've been talking about it all along, but I just kind of wanted to put one more emphasis on that, is that when Asaph was going through all these questions and difficulties and struggles in his present moment and his disappointment, it was through people's testimony and the testimony of God throughout history and his goodness that comforted him. Oh yeah, look what God did for Israel after 400 years of slavery. He freed them. We know now that God sent his son Jesus through that people, who is the Savior of the whole world. So there was a plan. God knew what he was doing. He wasn't absent. Even though he says in verse 18, your ways through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. He knows by looking back that God is there. And we can say the same is true today, even in the most heinous of trials. God is there. We just don't understand how he's working and why he is allowing things. There's he even mentions creation in this, and Jordan mentioned our outdoor ministry and how we love taking people in the outdoors, and we did a ton this summer, and I love it for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons I love going into the outdoors is because when I look deeply into creation, I see order, I see goodness, I see a plan, that God who made all this beautiful stuff that we go see, like it is just, he orchestrated it perfectly. And sometimes when I look at that or see something very specific, I'm reminded like, oh yeah, my life seems totally in chaos and I don't understand what's going on. But he made that pine cone. And that pine cone is intensely designed, perfectly designed for the purpose that it exists. Speaking of pine cones, okay? Did you know this? There was a researcher that researched pine trees, all sorts of different pine trees, in a lab, and noticed that the pine cone itself, the way it is designed, and the way the pine tree actually angles the pine cones on its branches is perfectly designed for the maximum amount of pollen to get into the pine cone to fertilize it. It's actually perfectly designed. There is no better aerodynamic way this could be built. I remember this summer we were up at Highlight Lake on one of our campouts, and all of a sudden there was this green cloud that started coming towards us. It was like this intense storm, and we're all like, Harry Potter? Like, oh my gosh, it was like that. It was like this green cloud coming toward us, and we realized, oh, that is pine pollen. Just all the pine trees were pollinating, and the wind was blowing, and this pine was everywhere, and the lake just got covered in that yellow pollen and everything like that. It was so wild to see that much pollen blowing around. And I've since learned, out of curiosity, that a pine cone, the way it is designed, it causes the wind to move in 3 different ways. One is in a corkscrew. It's a tight spiral, that when the wind hits this, it actually that causes the wind to do this tight spiral thing, which circles back and forces pollen in it. It also does a corkscrew shape around it, which also forces pollen in. And it also creates downwind eddies. So wind goes through here and it actually creates this full-on eddy to where the pollen circles back and has another try at it. Like, I love scientists who figure this stuff out. It's like, if that does not show us that God is in control and he is a planner, he knows what he's doing, he designed this pine cone perfectly to receive the fertilization that it needs. And then the last thing that is just totally crazy is they found that pine trees, when it's calm, pine trees will have their pine cones more upright. But when the wind blows, I don't know how this happens. It's almost like, is this tree alive or something? Like living, like has a brain? Like, how does this work? But in the wind, trees actually will contort the ends of their branches, and the pine cones will end up in a 45-degree angle, very commonly, which is the perfect angle for the pollen to enter. 45 degrees, not 90 degrees. It's just wild. That's one thing in creation that points to this God, like Asaph was looking back, that he is in control, we can trust him, and he is good. And lastly, as we close, I just want to encourage us that, it's very effective to look back, but we as Christians have so much more because of Jesus Christ and because of the good news of the Gospels, that we have hope to look ahead. And we have assurance to know that the suffering and pain we deal with and the lament that we feel is going to go away. It's going to be handled perfectly. In Romans 8:18-19, Paul writes this, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God." We know that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's holy plan to save us. We also have to wait because not everything is resolved yet, and we still have to live in a world that is rampantly impacted by evil. And so we wait. We trust him. We walk together. We encourage one another. And we keep worshiping him, and we don't sit down as followers of Jesus. Maybe you felt like you are in a situation where you can't see the footprints of God and you don't know how he's working, but does that necessarily mean that he's not? Asaph would say that he is. And I think this is why, as a church, like the writer of Hebrews, as I close with this just strong encouragement, in Hebrews chapter 10, this pastor who was speaking to this early church said this, "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as we see the day in the future approaching." So what he was saying to that early church who was going through persecution and trials that were horrible, he was saying, don't give up meeting together as some in the habit of doing. Don't sit down. Don't stop showing up. We as a church really value community, and we want to encourage you. We don't come to church on Sunday because it's a box to check off, like, okay, I did that. God's happy somehow. No, we do it because we desperately need to be together. We need to spur one another on. You may be really needed when you show up some Sunday for someone else who really needs a word of encouragement from you or an arm around the neck. So let us, as the day draws near, because it is near. Jesus is coming back. Let us continue to meet and pray and serve and walk alongside one another to carry on in this life full of ups and downs. Amen? Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you so much for the gift of these Psalms that just address all different aspects of life. And Lord, I know there's no way to adequately cover this topic this morning, of this Psalm of lament. But I just pray, Jesus, that you would miraculously, only through your Holy Spirit's power, specifically encourage each one of us to keep walking with you and to not sit down. And that our eyes would be on you, and that we would have joy, that we would be able to rejoice even in the midst of really challenging things as a church. Because we know the end. The end is you. And you are who we are going to be joined with for eternity. Let me pray this in your name. Amen. One of the things that we like to do as